Awhawhiu mai, kia ora tātou, Pacific greetings. Thank you, Mike, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and it's an honour, and I feel uncomfortable speaking before a room of people who do things. I come from a family of health workers. My mother has been a nurse at Middlemore Hospital for nearly 30 years. My wife, who many of you know, probably know much better than myself, has worked in public health in New Zealand for 10 years and for 10 years in the United States. These people do things. I think things and I say things. And the thing I like least is when people talk when they really should be listening. I feel like I should be listening. I'm talking, though, because Monique is very persuasive. She asked my cousin, named after my oldest brother, to ask me. And because one of my closest and dearest friends, Manasi Lua, who you know much better than myself, works at Levar. And he really works. I don't often say that. When they ask me to do something, I'll do it. So I talk not because I think I should, but because I've been asked to. And Monique asked me to talk about GPS. GPS, growing Pacific solutions. What a wonderful idea. And GPS, global positioning system. Also a wonderful idea. My wife wouldn't find her way here without it. Pacific solutions. I'm in trouble now. Pacific solutions are several thousand years old. GPS is about 20 years old. GPS is made up of 30 satellites. They orbit the Earth at an average height of about 20,000 kilometers. They orbit the Earth so fast that they get around the Earth twice a day. The average speed is close to 4,000 meters per second of a GPS satellite. That's 14,000 kilometers an hour. They do this to send very small messages down to those receivers that we have in our hands and in our phones and in our cars. By a series of very precise computations, our receivers take those messages and work out within an exactitude of a meter, often, where we are. This awesome precision is no accident. The United States government designed this system to be able to see very small targets moving at high speeds. They designed it so they could send nuclear weapons onto small moving targets over great distances. You already know when you think about it how expensive the GPS must be to send 30 satellites into space. There are really only 3 nations that can afford to run these. One, Russia, never finished theirs. One, China, is building theirs as we speak. We only use the GPS system because Bill Clinton said we could. And he only said we could use a part of it. Most of the GPS potential uses are only for the US military and their friends. In fact, if you have a GPS receiver that can track you moving 500 miles an hour or faster, the US government calls it a weapon. You can't buy or sell it. When you think about it, it's as if nothing could be less connected to us as people than the GPS system. Satellites 20,000 kilometers away, moving 14,000 kilometers an hour. Except, right here on the ground, there's hardware. There's stuff that makes GPS work. There's a station that controls the whole thing. You can't see it on Google Maps because they hide it. And then there are 6 tracking stations on the ground which track the movements of those high-flying, fast-moving, high-tech satellites. And as if to remind us that the Pacific is 1/3 of the planet, 2 of those tracking stations are right here in the Pacific. One is in Hawaii, a Polynesian kingdom overthrown by the US, now the most militarized place in America. The other is in a place even most Pacific Islanders have never heard of, a place that its people call Kwajalein. a place, the largest island, Kwajalein, in an atoll, Kwajalein, which is perhaps the largest lagoon on Earth. The people of this island, Kwajalein, have been kicked off it for that tracking station. They actually live next door, across the water, in perhaps the most densely inhabited place on Earth. An island, a Pacific island, that has 15,000 people living on 80 acres. That's a density 3 times that of Manhattan. They're only allowed to go to their home island when they have a pass from the US military, and they're only allowed to go there when they work as cleaners or nannies. GPS is anchored right here in the Pacific. GPS is obviously not how our ancestors navigated. It's only 20 years old. Yet our ancestors navigated. For most of human history, Pacific Islanders were the supreme navigators on the planet for thousands of years. It took Europeans and Africans until 1336 to discover the Canary Islands, which are about 200 kilometers off their coast. By the time they discovered those islands, Pacific Islanders had found every single piece of land in the largest body of water on the planet. Every single one. And most of them were, by our measures, small. Most of them could not be seen unless you came within 12 to 15 kilometers of them. This is one of the most dazzling human achievements. It's one of the most dazzling we can imagine. It's an achievement even greater than GPS. Finding these islands was not accomplished easily or by the same people. Dozens of Pacific Island cultures founded their own ways of navigating the Pacific. Only about 15 million people are Pacific Islanders. That's less than 1% of the world's population. But they speak nearly 1,500 languages. That is 1 in 5 of the world's languages. They are 1 in 5 of the world's cultures. And each one of them navigated differently. There were some things they shared in common. Most of you will know them. They shared the use of stars in common, very precise use of stars, using stars as they came up on the horizon for direction. Stars, as you know, move across the sky, and using them just as they fell into the water. All of the navigators used this common technique. They used stars called zenith stars that sit over particular islands, latitudinal stars that tell you how high you are. They use stars, in the case of most of the Pacific, the Southern Cross. From there you can figure out where the southern celestial pole is, to also calculate latitude. But they did things that no other navigational system did with such precision, and that is they learnt the environment and the ocean. They did things which for many years scholars said are not usable when you navigate. They felt swells. Right up until almost my lifetime, people told Pacific Island navigators that you cannot use a swell to navigate. They're just waves. It's just the wind. Except they did. There are 2 kinds of swells these navigators have instructed us in. There is a short swell, which bounces off islands or is caused by a local wind. And there is a deep swell that is set in motion by the deep fetch of winds. That's the one you use, and that's the one navigators have to learn. It wasn't thought to exist by Western navigators. They used winds. Again, another technique which is not supposed to be usable as a tool of navigation. When people finally took these navigators seriously, they realized that winds come from different quarters and with regularity, and they have different qualities. A wind from the south in New Zealand, as we all know, is cold. It's also drier than a wind from the north. And if you are trained and highly attuned to the world you live in, you will detect the difference between a northern and a southerly wind, and so on. They learnt how to watch and observe and learn directions from animals. by knowing which birds in particular and which fish live close to shallows and which live far out to sea. Which birds live at sea, which birds fish in the morning and return in the evening, which birds do vice versa. These navigators turned small islands into enormous places, places where they imagined only the unknowledgeable and skillless could miss islands, not places where islands were difficult to see. They expanded the island to the fullness of its environment. They even discovered things which scientists are still trying to explain. In Micronesia, navigators discovered at certain times of the night and season, you can strike the water and it has what they call underwater lightning, which directs you straight to an island. When they told this to European navigators, they laughed. There's no such thing. Until these people knew when to listen and not talk and discovered there is such a thing. And it works, and it's worked for thousands of years. So we have a system by which Pacific people have solved and navigated for millennia. And it's difficult to imagine two navigational knowledges more different than this Pacific set of knowledges and GPS. Pacific knowledge is instrumentless. It is all contained in the mind, the senses, and the body. It turns on the mastery of its practitioners. GPS, on the other hand, pays no heed of users. Most people who use GPS have no idea how it works. They couldn't explain it to you if they asked. All they do is turn it on. One is individualized, resident in that mind and body, and the other is mass-produced and external. It's the same for everyone. It's the same everywhere. But both work. Both can get you where you're going. But the difference is vital. The greatest scholar of Pacific navigation, the first European navigator to decide to listen, David Lewis, reflected that Pacific Islanders weren't actually doing what European navigators were doing. They didn't have to know all the time exactly where they were, like European navigators need to. He argued that what Pacific Island navigators seemed to be doing and most interested in was finding a way. Most European navigation is about precision. You spend a long time learning trigonometry, how to calculate, triangulate, how to measure the stars, turn it into numbers, to then insert into your formulas. These are all absolutely central calculations to European navigation and to GPS. In fact, so much so that European navigation is entirely fixed on time. The great problems in European navigation were all about knowing the time, because the time, by European measures, made the world stand still. If you knew what time it was where you were standing, you could calculate your longitude, and then you would know exactly where you are. This is not how Pacific navigation works. Pacific navigators took their measure not by their own abstractions, but from the world around them. The seas, the seasons, the animals, the waters, their communities. GPS is built on a discipline that masters nature, that creates its own abstract measures. Pacific navigation is built on a mastery of oneself, one's mind and senses, and the discipline of entire communities. I teach my students about Pacific navigation because I hope it will inspire them. I hope it will inspire them because in our navigators we see something we do too little to celebrate. We see a reification of intellectual excellence. I think of this image I once saw many years ago of one of the great traditional navigators of the Pacific, Maupiluk, and he's teaching 6 or 7-year-olds the stars. they're sitting in a circle around him. And in the middle, he has these stones laid out, which he's moving around with a stick. And they're all chanting the names of the stars and tracking their movements across his simulated sky. When they get it wrong, he uses his stick to hit them. Not hard. Harder than I'd like to be hit. Would be illegal here. Thankfully, yeah. This is a school of knowledge. Because he knows what we all know, that in navigation, there is no B grade or C grade. Navigation doesn't see the color of your skin or the language you speak. What navigation is about is what David Lewis called the iron discipline of navigation. Either there is land or there isn't. It's A plus or it is a fail grade. Right? These children were learning to be precise. In fact, they were learning to be perfect. In Pulawat, where Maupiolog comes from, they say navigators are so smooth and so enriching, they call them poi, the beaten pulp of the taro, cooked taro. The pulp that's beaten by women, incidentally, as a friend of mine reminds me. To be poi, to be that smooth and that perfect, is something we should aspire to. So I use this example as one of intellectual excellence because it is a great one. And too often we celebrate so many other fields of our achievement, but not the achievements of people like those people in this room, in the mind, in our lives, making a difference in the most intimate and powerful ways. It's also a reminder that there's nothing fancy about teaching. Teaching is about taking the time, making the commitment, and building the relationship. I'm reminded that when they first tried to resurrect Polynesian voyaging in 1976, they got Maupiolog to captain the ship from Hawaii to Tahiti. And he was captaining it. And they were halfway there, and the crew rebelled. They looked at this old guy who didn't know how to read, who couldn't speak English, who wore a loincloth, and they lost their faith in him. They thought, such a man, what could he know about the sea? What could he know about how to find a way? Only because of his own generosity and love for these people did he stick around when he'd been so insulted and take them to Tahiti. And all of them learnt this lesson at that moment, that there is a kind of leadership, an ability to find a way that stems purely from what we have and what we had. And it is the most powerful and most suitable one. It's also a collective one. This is the other lesson we can take from navigation and voyaging. It's not enough to simply know the way. You have to get there. And you have to get everyone there safely and together. I often worry as I'm teaching students about navigation that rather than making their ancestors feel close to them, it makes them feel further away. Our children in Auckland, most of them have never been to sea in a boat. Our children in Auckland, most of them, in fact, many of them, can't even swim. The beach in New Zealand is a place where wealthy and leisured people go. It's not a place of community and work like it is in the islands. Right? The beaches near where most of us live are not nice beaches to swim at. Right? We know this. It's not like it was in Whaleolupo or Pukapuka or Eua. The beaches in New Zealand are different, and our own children may not be able to link to the sea in quite the ways that we used to. But in this model of how our ancestors got around the ocean, there's a place for everyone. Being in a boat, being at sea, which may be foreign to, well, far too many of us, is not the pure experience it was. We can think about it in a different way. The way in which all these successful voyages were built on communities. It began for instance, with the building of a vessel, the work of many. We often think about that canoe builder, but it turned out canoe building, canoe carving was about the easiest part of building a canoe to resurrect. The toughest part, the part where the knowledge had proved most vital and most fragile, was in the making of sails. Sails for these canoes were woven. But if any of you, maybe not, follow the Around the World race, sails are the very cutting edge of technology. They use the strongest and most expensive materials humanity makes. And we had people weaving them, high-performance sails. There was only a few places left in the world where women still knew how to make these sails, only 25 years ago. The critical part to sailing begins on shore. What about how we eat, how we supply the ship? How do we preserve the food? How do we store the water? The provisioning of a voyage entailed all this knowledge and community work, which was absolutely decisive in whether or not the voyage would be successful. Salting the fish, preserving the breadfruit. All of this had to take place before that joint enterprise of setting sail. I make my students shut their eyes to try and imagine this. I mean, Manasseh asked me if I had any pictures. I don't have any pictures from back then, so I want you to close your eyes and try and picture this. You're on one of these great alia, or kalia. This was the ship coming into use about 1600. The vessel's about 20 to 30 meters long. Big by wooden boat standards, small by all of our standards. There's 50 of you. Your mother, your father, your children, your brothers and sisters, your grandparents. The boat is absolutely full. It's filled with food and water and tools and spares for the boat, cordage and all those things the boat will need. There's enough plants and seeds and stocks to build a world. Everything you value is on that boat, whether it's ava or breadfruit or taro. And then right there in the middle of the boat, there are animals, enough chickens and pigs and dogs and rats to people the universe. It's crowded. And then you look into the middle of the ship, the platform between the two hulls, and right there in the middle of a wooden ship is a fire burning to preserve fish, to keep you warm. Some people are sailing the vessel, others are working it. Some are fishing, children are playing. But each person on that vessel has to be acting with a common purpose. This is a family, a village at sea. They're working with this common discipline, this common purpose, that is all that will keep them alive. Everyone has to be there because individually, the new world for them, this new land they're seeking for, is not possible. Each person knows something another person doesn't. I hope you can see it. These vessels, and there are hundreds of them in our history, the histories that bring us to this place, was a community on the verge of the greatest discoveries humankind has ever known. And they were families. They were also on the verge of destruction, great danger. These were not easy trips. Their very existence was open to doubt. But simply by sailing in these new directions, they enlarged the world. This, I think, and you can open your eyes unless you're asleep. Keep them slow. This, I think, is a metaphor for our present. These families that are at sea and really only have each other from which to draw their solutions and their strengths, through which to survive, but through which the possibilities of discovery are amazing. This is why I often think, I don't really have great evidence for this, but I think that the true unit of Polynesia is not the family, but the canoe. Pacific families are the right size for a canoe. Here in New Zealand, they even trace their genealogy, their whakapapa, to the waka. Right? Throughout Upper Polynesia, you see a similar thing, where all these parts, whether it's Hapai or Vaofonoti in Samoa, or even the Cook Islands, only make sense if there's a canoe connecting them. There's some deep commonalities. And the commonalities, I think, show this deep history of the canoe. Because I'm an academic, I'm kind of paid to disagree with people. But I was listening to one of my colleagues just last week, talking to my class about the Wha-Samoa. And he said there are 3 core principles to the Wha-Samoa. And of course, every Samoan's going to say 3, I would have 4, or I'd have 2. The 3 he listed, I think, were really powerful. Right? Wha-alo-alo, respect. Right? If you imagine that canoe, how could you run a canoe and not lose children overboard, not have people rebelling unless it was built on the sense of respect of how the canoe would work? Right? Alofa, this commitment to each other and the common good. And tautua, the greatest of all, the commitment to serve one another. This is what made these navigations both possible and successful. These dangerous exploratory voyages were not things you could undertake lightly, just like you don't undertake your work lightly as you go about it. The risks are high, the rewards are high too. For many years, in fact, when I was a young scholar, we were told that the dangers of these voyages were so high, only immense pressures would make people leave. They lost a war, they lost their land, they were afraid, there was a famine. But you could not set forth on this kind of voyage unless you were completely prepared. If you had everything that you needed to build a new world. In actual fact, we know from our own age that the exploration of space, which is the only thing comparable to the explorations Pacific Islanders undertook, the exploration of space only takes place when there's lots of money and people have been preparing for it for years. And if we look at a map of the Pacific, the way that Polynesians very deliberately set out, first of all from New Guinea, down through the Solomons, Vanuatu, to Fiji, and then very orderly into the very teeth of the wind, the westerly that dominates the Pacific, we get a strong sense of how there was a deep strategy about how this exploration would take place. Lots of people who were not people of this ocean suggested the fact that islanders settled the Pacific, they had to be blown across the Pacific with the westerly wind, which meant they came from South America. But everyone knows we came from Southeast Asia, which means we had to sail into the wind, the hardest route, directly against where we would be pushed. What that meant was the hard work was done up front. If you got into trouble, if something went wrong, home was much closer. There was a deep strategy based on the security of these families to first of all do the hard things. Always keep in mind, as I'm sure you do, a safe voyage home. In these voyages, there had to be great innovations. The space metaphor is totally apt. What you had on your canoe when you left the islands was all you would have. You might catch some fish, otherwise you would have to have everything you needed. And you didn't know where you were going to land. You might land in New Zealand, as Polynesians did. You might land on Tuamotu, an atoll. Right? So you needed everything to fix the boat, to keep your family safe, and to build the new world you would make. And along the way, all we see is innovation. The canoes that Polynesians set out with look nothing like those they land with. The asymmetric hulls, which give boats lift, which would be discovered by Europeans when they flew aircraft, You can see them in Pacific Island catamarans. You can see the way that, and one of the great challenges when Pacific Islanders landed here in New Zealand, they innovated. They brought with them taro. They brought with them paper mulberry to make tapa. Neither of those plants grew well enough here. If they'd stuck with those plants, there would be no Māori. They would have nothing to wear. They found flax. They found replacement foods like kumara that grew throughout the country. They found something that Polynesians are still averse to. They found snow. Right. They did things which still blow my mind. We know now that New Zealand has very little iodine in its soil. If you just eat food grown in New Zealand, naturally you'll get goiter. Your glands will swell up. But when Europeans arrived, rates of goiter were very, very low in New Zealand. Māori had learnt to find a different source of iodine without even having a name for iodine: seaweed. Or we look at the other innovations that people have made when they arrived on different boats. The way that Pacific churches in New Zealand are just like they were up in the islands, but completely different. Or we can look at this conference as Pacific a place as there is in New Zealand, but also the first of its kind. In Samoa, I often have my mind blown by thinking about mamala, which is a plant that Samoans have been using for centuries to heal sickness, and which bioprospectors discovered is one of the few actively acting antiretroviral agents in the world, meaning it attacks viruses after they've gone away, the viral reservoirs. Right? Samoans knew this, and were using it as such. How did they know? Right? What led them to find the bark of this one tree? It's this innovative drive. Now, of course, need is a great driver of innovation. You need things. But it's never enough. Need has to be balanced by some sort of strength, some sort of ability or capacity or brilliance. And it's precisely this that I think is why Pacific Islanders in New Zealand are so vibrant and on the verge of these kinds of innovations, as well as having achieved them. I know in the next few years people will get sick of me talking about how New Zealand's future really is the Pacific. There are two places in New Zealand that New Zealand's future will be decided in. And anyone who's thought about it will agree with me, which means if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. One is the Pacific itself. When we look north, we see the defining contest of our generation and the next generation between the United States and China. And that engagement will take place in our homelands and in our home ocean. And it will matter what we do. It already does. Everyone here knows the Chinese aren't building buildings in Samoa, and the Americans aren't building buildings in Guam just as gifts. We matter in this story. In fact, New Zealand will have not enough capacity to compete with those big guys. The only way New Zealand will ever be able to compete in the Pacific is through relationships, friendships, and mutuality. And the experts in that are you people, the people who live it. And even when you come back to New Zealand, especially when you stand here, not far from where I grew up in GI, the other space New Zealand's future is being decided is looking south. Statisticians tell us in about 35 years, this will be a majority Polynesian nation. What we do in the south precinct of this city will define what New Zealand becomes. Right? We all know that. Unfortunately, not enough people outside this room know that. But that doesn't really matter because the people who are making a difference are right here. You all learnt some time ago, it's no use waiting for the cavalry. The cavalry isn't coming. You also know that when the cavalry comes, the first thing they tend to do is shoot people who look like us. You grow Pacific Solutions because it's what you do. You grow Pacific solutions because the alternative is the wrong solutions. It's actually more problems. This discipline and excellence, this commitment and this turning back to our own resources and strength is precisely what our people need. It's precisely what this part of New Zealand needs. And it's all that will make this a great country in the future. So you're captaining ships. You're trying to hold it together in dangerous times. I've been back only a little while. I can see the great potential. I've also, like you all see, the tremendous problems that lie before us. What you have in front of us is a tremendous burden. You're the doers. The advantage is you're making a new world like your ancestors, the navigators before you. Thank you.